Hi, welcome to JJ Atkins Art. Today we're going to be taking a look at part 3 of our John Wick caricature breakdown. Now in part 1, we broke down all the basic elements of developing the caricature of the face, and then in part 2 we moved on to the anatomy of the body, the hands, and the gun, and being able to draw all those in perspective. Finally, we finished up part 2 by coming to the final line drawing that allows us to move over to the coloring phase. Okay, so we moved over into Procreate just to take a closer look at some of the tools that we're going to be using and a couple of the techniques we're going to be using as we get into this coloring and lighting phase. Now, again, we have the final product here on the right-hand side, but let me just take a moment to pull up our reference photos, and you'll see as we're talking about the color, what we're going to be using here. Just point your attention to this picture up here on the top. This is what we're going to be using as our color reference, or at least a little bit of a guide as to how to lay in our color. We have something of a yellow, kind of an orangish color on the on the left-hand side, and then purple on the right-hand side. We have two main light sources, and all of our shadows kind of shift to almost the center of the figure as a result. So again, we're going to use this as something of an inspiration, and you can see kind of how far I took that in the sense that I even put in something of a kind of a lantern or a street light behind John Wick to kind of produce that yellow-orange light source that we see on the left-hand side. It's not very clear in the photograph, but that's pretty much what they did in the movie as well. And then the purple light is coming from some other source, like the street or maybe the sky or something to that effect. Kind of hard to say at this point. Now, the rain is going to be something we'll have to take care of a little bit later as well, but we'll leave that to the side right now and just kind of focus on our main coloring, lighting, and of course, shadow also. So let's go ahead and get back into the time lapse. We're going to talk about how we build up the background lighting and use that to inform some of the colors that we'll put in a little bit later. Now back in our time lapse, you'll see that I'm starting with all my background elements, and the coloring of those background elements is really kind of an important thing to start with. Methods will vary in here, and I'm not going to tell you how to create your own artwork, but I will kind of advise that starting with the background, especially the coloring of it, is going to be a really helpful thing to do to kind of help set mood and inform some of the lighting and shadowing decisions you're going to make when you get into the major parts of your figure or any of the other elements in your piece. Once I've kind of roughly put in just kind of that basic color scheme that I'm looking for between the oranges and the purples, then I'm going to bring back in my line drawing and start filling in some just bold blocks of color to help me separate my layers. And that's why you're seeing these unusual colors. The colors really don't matter at this point. I'm just trying to make sure that I have nice separation of my layers so it's easy to kind of see what sits on top of each other when I go into that true coloring phase a little bit later on. So let me just stop here really quick, and I want to kind of show you how to separate these layers before we get into actually putting in some true color. Okay, now I've come back to Procreate here just real briefly to show you a little bit about how I use line work to help out with the coloring. Now all I'm going to do is just put just a circle here on the screen. Nothing fancy about it, but let's just imagine for just a moment here that this is just a head or a face. The important thing to consider is that I've had this shape completely closed off. There's no open areas, and that's important because when I want to go in and fill in colors a little bit later on, say like a blue, I can do that quickly. Notice just by doing a kind of a drop fill method. And without any openings, that color won't spill out in the areas that I don't want it to go. Now, if I do this though, notice my layer. I filled in the layer that has the line work in it, and maybe I don't necessarily want to do it that way. So let me kind of back this out, and I'll kind of show you a different method that I use when it comes time to kind of get my coloring done. So I have my layer here with my line work on it, and I want to preserve that line work just in case I need to come back to it later and use it as a backup step in case I mess something up and want to delete it later on. So I always duplicate my layer, and then I will use the bottom layer to color in, and I can do anything to it I want to and still have the preserved layer over top of it that keeps my line work intact and untouched. As a matter of fact, sometimes I'll even lock that layer just to make sure I don't accidentally draw over top of it. So here's now what I can do. I'm going to be working on that bottom layer that has the duplicate of the line work, and I'm going to use it to fill in just some sort of, vague flesh tone, something like that, all right? Now that I've got that in there, then I can go in and start putting in shadow and light to try to get some sense of three-dimensionality out of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a layer over top of it. And what I'm going to do to that layer over top of my colored layer is I'm going to set it to a clipping mask. Now, this is going to be a really nice thing to do because when I go and put in shadow later, let's just assume this is my shadow color, notice as I paint it in, it won't go outside my initial area, my initial face, my initial head, whatever you want to call that. That's a really handy thing. It's going to make your coloring and your shading a lot easier and keep from spilling over into areas that it shouldn't go over into. Now, when it does come to shadows, I like to use a blend mode. So if you click on this little N right here, that's going to get you into your little blend modes for your layer. And I'm going to go all the way up to the top of the list and choose multiply. I use multiply for all my shadows. It's just a nice, easy way to kind of get things done. And when it comes to choosing a color for my shadows, I usually go with one of two methods. Cool shadow or warm shadow, understanding that at some point or another I'm going to have to deal with the opposite. So a cool shadow should have a warm light source and vice versa. And for this exercise, we'll just use a cool shadow. Now, that means I'm in the blue area, but I want it to be very desaturated. I'm actually going to come over here into this gray. A little bit of blue, mostly gray, not a lot of value to it, very light. And then I'm going to use that, again, as a shadow. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm put this on a multiply layer. And multiply means it's going to bring some of that yellowish color from underneath and mix it with this blue-gray that I'm about to lay down. And when I do that, notice what I get is something that's actually not a blue or a gray or the initial color that I started with. If I did this on a non-blend layer, if I didn't have it on that multiply mode, notice what comes up here is kind of a bluish-grayish color, all right? But because of that multiply setting, I now get something that looks more like a natural shadow. And this is a pretty hard line shadow. In some cases, you may want that. But if I want something that's a little bit more soft, a little bit more subtle, what I might do is use my little smudge tool. And my smudge tool is just sent to a soft airbrush. And all I do is just kind of come in here and just kind of gently draw over top of it if I was on the right layer. And I can kind of blend that a little bit. Oh, that's a little bit too much. Let me back that out a little bit. Shrink down. And then there we go. I can kind of blend and get a little bit of a softer edge if that's my preference. All right. Now I'm going to do something similar with the lighting effects. And with the lighting effects, I'm just going to go on the opposite side. So again, I'm going to put on another layer. I'm going to set it to a clipping mask, so that way it stays within the shape that I've already defined. And then what I can also do here is set the blend mode here, maybe on hard light. I move around a little bit on this depending on what I want. It might be a hard light, might be vivid light, might be linear light. Sometimes I'll just paint in my color and then choose the blend mode from there, depending on what I want. The other thing you might want to keep in mind here is that you also have an opacity setting. So if your shadow or your light is just a little bit too strong, you can always go back and take this layer and choose the lower the opacity on it, make it a little bit more subtle, and I think you'll be happy with the effect once you kind of dial that in a little bit. So again, I'm choosing hard light here for my light, and what I'm going to do here is choose different colors. So I got a cool type of a shadow. I'm going to go for a more warm type light source. And notice what I'm doing here. Again, not a lot of saturation here. I'm just going to get it up towards the white a little bit. Not all the way, because I'll have nothing to kind of use as a highlight later. So I'm going to use genuinely this kind of almost a yellowish, warmish light. And then I'm going to paint it in on the other side, just like so. And what I might do also is get my little smudge tool out and give that a little touch up to make it blend a little bit better. And then there we go. All right. So again, not the best job in the entire world, but you can see how this effect can be applied to other areas. And once you understand the anatomy of the face a little bit, you can understand how light sources kind of pull out shapes like noses or shadows go into the wells of the eyes and, and so on and so forth. As something of a last step, we can also color in our line work as well. So what I might also do is make another duplicate of my line work and then just hide one of them, just so that way I have it as a backup in case I need it. But now that I have another copy of my line work, I can unlock it and I can draw over top of it. Now I'm going to set this layer to an alpha lock. It's a slightly different thing, but what it means here is that I can't draw on anything other than what's inside here. In other words, this black line is the only thing I'm able to draw on. If I'm going to color it in and I'm going to get into that layer, there it is. All I can do is color the line and nothing else. And notice when I do this, when I just kind of give it a nice little color right here like this, okay? And then I put back in my main layer of the color, then my shadow, my light, it doesn't quite match up here, but I can still change that a little bit. For example, I can color pick by just pressing on the color there, the shadow color, and just kind of paint it in to match it up a little bit like that. And again, I can use my smudge tool to kind of blend that in a little bit, and notice that we get a little bit more subtle effect of the shadow. And last but not least, if we want to kind of take this one last step here, what we might also think about doing is adding in just maybe a bit of a cast shadow on the ground to give it some sense that it occupies like some physical space. So maybe we'll do a little something like this, like that. And I will move the layer underneath everything so that way it kind of hides behind the main object. A little something like that. Now again, simple exercise, but using some basic tools like this, we can get something of a nice three-dimensional rendering. And we're going to use those same principles and apply it to our coloring method as we get back into the time lapse. Okay, now welcome back to the time lapse, and let's start talking about our light sources here a little bit. You have two light sources, so this is going to complicate things just a little bit. On the left-hand side of our figure, we have something of an orange and yellow that we're going to be dealing with, and on the right side, we're going to be painting in some purple. Now, I used the method I talked about a little bit earlier when we went into Procreate, into that deep dive of getting the basic main colors in here. Kind of a grayish, dark gray for the suit, the basic Caucasian flesh tone, and the kind of whitish around his sleeve cuffs. Now, I've also established something of a palette. Up on the very, very top layer above everything else, with no blend mode set to it or anything like that, I set up the colors that I'm going to be using for the shadows and the lights. And I'm setting up two sets of these. So there's a light shadow and a dark shadow. And I got those just by going into the color picker like I did in the demo a few minutes ago, and choosing that blue, desaturated gray, and then choosing a darker version of that for some deeper shadows a little bit later on. I did something similar for my light source. Now again, I have two light sources, so it's going to be a total of 4 colors. I have a purple light source, and then a lighter version of that for kind of more of a highlight type purpose. And then I have a yellowish orange light source and a lighter, more whiter version of that for highlights later on as well. As I'm painting in the shadow and the light, notice I'm kind of going back and forth. So remember, all these things should have their own layers. There is a light shadow layer, a dark shadow layer, a yellow-orange light layer, and a lighter version of that layer. And then the same thing with the purple. Now, I had to cheat this a little bit. I may have mentioned in a previous video, I had a limited amount of layers that I had at my disposal because I was working in a kind of a higher resolution on this particular picture. So some of my layers I did have to kind of combine together after a while, and some of the preservation of line work and things like that kind of had to be sacrificed along the way. I'll leave it to you to kind of figure out your own methods through some trial and error, and that's really what it's going to end up having to be. You'll figure out a way to kind of work with layers and work with shadows and lights and stuff like that, mostly through more experimentation than anything else. But I really recommend that when you are going to move into that experimentation phase, that you use photo reference. It's what I did for this, and I really think I got some really interesting lighting effects from the photo reference that I wouldn't have achieved if I was just trying to do this out of my basic imagination without any real kind of guide to go by. Now, what I found to be really interesting about this is that light was kind of applied in 2 main layers, as I mentioned before. So if we kind of focus on the right-hand side here a little bit, we can kind of see that kind of played out in the purple. I started by laying down a layer of just the regular purple color set to a hard light blend mode on that layer. But then, after that was all said and done, and you can kind of see this in the sleeve there, it was kind of put in there and kind of airbrushed so it had something of a softer fade over to the left portion of the arm. Then an additional layer was placed over top of that for the lighter purple color. And that had more of kind of a hard, bold kind of feel to it, and it doesn't blend as much. It has kind of more of a harder edge to it than the darker purple does. It achieves an interesting effect. It's almost like there's a glow of light coming behind him, and we'll see something similar to that repeated when we get into the left-hand side and we address getting that light source over his shoulder to shine a little bit brighter and light up the left shoulder of his jacket. I'm still working in the purples here for right now, though, so you'll see that this purple is going to be really important to certain elements of the piece. I've mentioned the jacket, certainly, but it is going to come into play in some of the line work around his hand, if you haven't seen it already. I've also got something of a purple shine, a reflection, if you will, coming off the gun, just kind of tied back into that. And, of course, we see the purple in his face and in his hair also. Now, the interesting thing here is that we also have a little bit of a shadow. Now, that shadow is kind of sitting mostly on the middle of his face, but a little bit later on, I am going to go darken on the purple on the right-hand side of his face with a little bit more of that shadow color, just to get it to balance a little bit better with the true light source, which is that light on the left-hand side. Okay, now just a brief word on the hair before we wrap this up. The hair is something I consider to be some of the detail work, and that, along with the rain and a couple of other little highlights that we're going to be painting a little bit later, are all going to be summed up and discussed in a little bit more detail in our next video. The purpose of this one is really just to kind of talk about how we use layers to get our shadow, our light, and our basic colors in. So if you have any questions about anything that I've done, feel free to leave a comment down below. And while I have a moment here, let me just take a second to do my shameless plug and ask you to take a moment and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you have subscribed, click on that like button. Let me just take a second here to say thanks for watching the video, and of course thank you for your support. I'll have the next one published in the near future, so I hope to see you again soon. In the meantime, take care.